So, you began playing Magic the Gathering, you had a bit of fun with the precon decks, but now you want to move on to something bigger and better. But the problem is, you keep seeing all the different deck lists and you realize that there are a lot of Mythic cards in them. However, you don't really know which decks are actually tier 1 and good decks and which decks are just people having a bit of fun, unless of course you're looking at the top 8 list. In this video, I'm gonna go over all the Mythic cards and highlight the good ones from the bad ones and meme ones. Now this list will be based upon the viability of the cards and not my own opinions, cause otherwise we would see a lot of random cards in here that are actually not that very good, but that I enjoy playing. Alright, let's get started, and we're gonna do this color by color. So the first card, History of Benalia. Obviously if you wanna play knights or tokens, you really should make this. This is a staple card, it is really good, it's hard to answer. However, if you're gonna go with tokens or knight and crafting History of Benalia, you probably want 4 copies of this card. Next up we have an angel. Now this one, not so much. It is a bit slow, and if you are in a position to gain 5 life, well, you're probably already in a winning position and you probably want that 3 mana for something much better. Next up we have the first Planeswalker, Ajani, and this one is really good. You want him in mono white and in tokens pretty much, but you would probably stick to 2 and maybe a 3rd copy. Obviously he's really good together with History. You play History turn 3, then turn 4 you play Ajani and you're all set to win the game. I mean, not that easily, but the card is really strong. Next up we have the other version of Ajani. This one, not so much. It's too expensive, the effects are not as good as the other Ajani, and overall I would not craft this under any circumstances. The other Ajani just offers more. Divine Visitation, bit too expensive. You usually want to do something better with 5 mana than setting up for your next turn. Then we have Lyra Dawnbringer. She is obviously really good. If she sticks around, she can quite easily take over the game. She also fits in both control decks as a sideboard card, and she fits in the main decks of mono white and sometimes tokens. However, I would never make more than 2 copies of Lyra Dawnbringer, at least for the moment. Next up we have a random dinosaur. Unless you're a die-hard dinosaur player, this one you can pretty much skip. It's not very good, even in a dino deck. There's just too many ways in standard to deal with a threat that makes Enrage not really that viable. Conclave, hard removals, etc, etc, it's just not that good. Axis, no. This is a pure meme card, and that's about it. Walking Sun Avatar. Again, if you are a Dino fanboy, maybe you want to craft this, otherwise stay away from this. And even if you are a Dino fanboy, this is really expensive and hard to get out. And if you do cast him, you are probably already in a winning position. Next up we have the Time Stream Navigator. This one, not so much, it's not very good. A control deck doesn't have enough space to actually include him, and you would rather have something way more powerful than this, such as Nexus of Fate. Next up we have the first copy of Jace. This one, not so much. Sadly I have 2 copies, got one from my first pack and one from the daily reward thingy. His abilities are just a bit too weird to make him really work. For example, if you play a control deck, well, you want mana open on turn 3 to counter something, and if you're an aggro deck you want to play a creature or some kind of powerful draw spell, and Jace is usually not that. Coming up we have our first wizard. This one, not really. It's too expensive for what it is, and if you want to use the effect, well, you need to have a lot of mana open. And if you're playing wizard, you're usually playing an aggro type of deck and you're trying to win fast, and usually you won't get to a turn where this card becomes relevant. Coming up, however, we have a really good card, and that is the first version of Tezzeret. He has a lot of health and is obviously suited to either an artifact deck or a control deck. The token is really relevant in a control matchup. Having a constant threat every single turn that cannot be counterspelled is a huge deal. And against creature decks, it obviously provides a shield every single turn until eventually you draw the spells that you need to clear out the board or take over the game. I would definitely recommend creating Tesserets between 2 and 3. There are very few Planeswalkers that I would recommend getting all 4. Then we have a little Sphinx. This guy, too expensive really. 6 mana, he doesn't really fit the control decks, maybe as a one-off, but this guy, as for now, you can pretty much ignore him. Sadly, I really want the Sphinx to work, but it's just too expensive for what it does, and what it is doing is not that good if you actually really look at it. Sure, if the Sphinx actually countered something, it would be great, but he's not a Gear Hulk. Let's leave it at that. Then we have our second version of Jace. This one, just gonna say no. 6 mana to draw a card or untap all your creatures. I mean, no. Then we have the second version of Tezzeret. This one, not so much. I mean, it's just like the Jace. 6 mana to draw 1 card or make it 5/5. You can do so much more with 5 mana and actually take over the game. Next up we have Nexus of Fate. Nah, this card, ooh. Obviously if you are an ultra control player and you play a deck with 1 win condition, that is Teferi, sure, make Nexus of Fate, but you be aware that people might start roping you when you start using this card. Just FYI. Now if you're gonna make it, you should have between 2 and 3 copies of Nexus of Fate depending on your deck type. Some people do run with 1, but be aware there are much more fun and better ways to spend your Mythic cards than playing Nexus of Fate. Overflow, Insight, no. Omniscience, no. Let's move over to black and let's move to Liliana. No one plays zombies, the effects are not very good, and for 4 mana you could cast Ritual of Soth or summon a dog. I mean, just no. Next up we have Phyrexian Scripture. This one not so much, it's too slow, and if your opponent has a huge board already, well, you're probably dead before this resolves next turn. Twilight Prophet, you could consider this card as a 1 to 2 off in certain vampire decks and also in certain version of control decks, but it's a bit too hard to keep it alive, and honestly there are better things to spend your Mythic cards on. Bone Dragon, no. You need to exile 7 cards to get the same effect that you get from a Phoenix, except it doesn't have haste, and it costs mana, a lot of it. Sadly, this dragon will probably never see play in standard. Dire Fleet Revenger, not so much, too expensive, too slow, doesn't have haste. Doom Whisperer, it was a quite hyped card when it came out, but it started falling off really hard, and as of late I haven't seen a single top 8 list including a Doom Whisperer, and he's starting to really fall behind the meta. He's just too slow, even though a 6/6 should be really powerful. Against aggro decks, paying life is certainly something you never want to do, and most control decks can deal with him quite easily. Let's move on to the second version of Liliana. Sadly, she's too slow, too expensive for what she does, so this is another card you can quite easily skip making. Demon Lord, the best little thingy. No. The effect is terrible, the cost is terrible, and that's all I'm gonna say about it. Let's move on to the mono black Raska. This one, no. Too expensive, doesn't do enough. 6 mana to basically murder a creature or give your creatures +1. Boneyard Parlay, nah, just another meme card. Let's move on to red and let's start with Sarkhan the Fireblood. Unless you are a die-hard dragon player, just no, it's not very good. Arclight Phoenix, the bane of standard. What is there to say about this card? It found a home in the Drake deck and is really good. If you're gonna make the Drake deck, you are gonna need 4 copies of Arclight Phoenix. However, outside of the Drake deck, he doesn't actually have a home. Rekindling Phoenix, a card seen in both control decks and in aggro decks. In control decks, usually as a 2-off, in aggro decks I've seen as many as 4 copies, either in mainboard or in the sideboard. Rowdy Crew, no. Moving on to Mr. Bladewing, just no. Too expensive with a kicker cost, and if you don't kick him with a kicker cost, you're basically getting a budget Phoenix that don't revive. I don't see the point of him. Moving on to the second red Planeswalker, this one is another skip, too expensive, does too little. Let's move on to Chandra. Again, does too little and is too expensive to run. And the fourth Planeswalker, again, same story, does too little, is too expensive to run. Next up we have a really good card in the form of the Star. This card, usually in the sideboard of control decks as a 1-off or maybe a 2-off at max. Obviously it deals with, well, everything, pretty much. There are very few things that can actually escape this card. Apex, no, it's just another meme card. Moving on to green, we have Nullhide Ferox. This card, 50-50. You probably don't want to craft it, but the card is not that bad. It is just not good enough to be in a tier 1 deck, really. Maybe in the sideboard, but I would hesitate actually recommending this card as a card that you want to craft. The second green card is Scapeshift. This one in standard, not so much, just another meme card for standard. Next up we have the first green Planeswalker in the form of Vivian Reed. This card is amazing and you should certainly craft this card if you're gonna play green white or green black. It deals with a lot of threats with its second ability and is really relevant at all stages of the game. Obviously if you get to the ultimate, you pretty much win the game. If you are gonna own this card, you should probably look at 2 to 3 copies. I would probably actually stick with 2. 3 is a bit much when the Planeswalker is this expensive to actually play, and you don't always want the effect on the board. Plus, if you're playing Gorgarian, you can probably bring it back from the graveyards a bunch of times anyway. Carnage Tyrant, yes, an amazing creature, can't be countered, hexproof. What more could you really want? Oh yeah, you get trample as well. Now if you do include Carnage Tyrants, you want between 3 to 4 copies. Usually 4 actually, because he usually comes with a bunch of elves to help him out. Moving on, we have this very bizarre card. It's not very good, it's too expensive for what it does, and more importantly, it has no protection, so in essence, it's a win more card, except it's very late game, and what would you rather have, this card or a Carnage Tyrant? I leave that decision up to you. The second version of Vivian, unlike the first one, is not that good. As with most of the card I don't recommend, it is just too expensive and does too little. Moving on, we have Polyraptor. Outside of funky combo decks, not so much. It's a card you can quite easily skip. The Great Worm. Again, too expensive, does too little, and can quite easily be dealt with in standard, either through enchantments, through counterspells, or by sacrificing. Let's move on to dual colors, and first up we have Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. Obviously if you're a control player, you need this card and you want 3 copies, no less, and certainly no more. Nothing worse than opening a hand with 2 Teferi in it, or even drawing into a third. Ooh, the horror. What else is there to say about Teferi, Hero of Dominaria? Well, it should never have been printed, it should be banned for pure frustration, but it won't be banned because reasons, and yeah, let's just move on from Teferi, go away. Wait, if I hate Teferi that much, why do I have 3 copies? Wait, am I a control player? Am I the bad guy? Oh, move on. We have a Sphinx. No. Just no, this Sphinx too expensive, does too little. I've said this quite a lot, but that's generally what makes or breaks a card. Second version of Teferi. I guess all the design went to the discard, and whoever did this card had probably played 1 game of Magic in his entire life. Just no, expensive. No. We have a vampire. Too easy to deal with. The tokens are not that relevant, just overall not very good for 4 mana. Moving on, we have another vampire. Again, too expensive. The effect is not good enough because you can only activate it on your turn, so you can't respond to something, and that makes the card really bad. Moving on, we have La Sava. This card is not bad, but there are a lot more powerful cards, and he doesn't fit into any deck really. Maybe in the upcoming expansion he will be a lot better, but for now he is not something you should worry about crafting. Betrayal. Now this card is interesting. I have not seen a lot of people using it, but the card is not bad. Especially in control decks, later on you can really screw up your opponent by playing this. You can take anything from their graveyard, and it's a really good card, but I can't recommend it because it's not a meta card, so the result may vary, and it's not a card like that makes a deck. It's a card you get for a deck later on to add into a sideboard to respond to a specific threat, but it's a card to keep an eye on. Let's move on to whatever this thing is. I'm just gonna say no, it doesn't do enough, it has no flash, and people will be able to deal with this on turn 4 quite easily. Moving on, we have Ral. This card is really good, but you don't want 4 copies. I keep opening him for some reason. You probably want to stick with 2 to 3, maybe just 2, but the card is not bad to craft. The second version of Ral, however, is really bad to craft. Again, expensive, way too expensive, 6 mana to draw a card, just no. 1000 Year Storm. If you hate other people, craft this card and make a combo deck. In best of 1, this is pure frustration, and you can go quite far with this. Keep in mind, people might rope you for playing this card, although once this card resolves, you usually win the next turn anyway. But this is a combo piece, and it is... I don't want to talk about it, okay? Let's move on. We have a random planeswalker that I never seen used. Let's leave it at that. I never seen this one used either. I mean, too expensive does too little. And when I say never used, I mean never used in competitive tier 1 standard decks that are viable right now. This card, however, is very viable, and that is Vraska the Golgarian Queen. Now you only need 2 copies of this card because if you play Golgari, well, you have about 1,000 different ways to fetch things from your graveyard. Obviously this card is just amazing, deal with a lot of things, and ultimate wins you the game. But most of the time this card ends up just being a card drawing engine. Then we have the Poor Lich. He's not too expensive, the effect is not bad, but it's not fast enough for 5 mana, and the health is not enough. It can quite easily be dealt with, leaving you with a turn 5 where you basically threw away 5 mana for something that will be quite easily dealt with by maybe 2 or even 1 mana. Obviously if he can stick around, he's decent, but it's not a card that you want to craft. The second version of Vraska Relic Seeker. Yes, this one is also really good, and unlike the first one, you might consider making more than 2 copies of this one. You could include as many as 3. I was gonna say 4, but 3 is probably enough. I've seen certain control decks actually run with this as a win condition. I will make a video about that another time, but for right now, this is a really good card. You could also include a single copy of this in your standard Golgarian deck. Again, it serves many of the same purposes, but most importantly, it helps you kill off enchantments, which can be really important for Golgarian decks. Let's move on to the third version of Vraska. This one, as I've been saying all night, too expensive, does too little. Chance for Glory, I mean, no, it's a meme card. Why do I have 2 copies? Because RNG hates me. Aurelia, Exemplar of Justice. The card is decent, but not good enough to be warranted, to be crafted, and most board decks has moved away from the whole mentor concept. Mentor is a good idea until you play against other players and they remove your mentor creatures one by one, and all you're left with is playing a single creature a turn that doesn't do anything else except mentoring, and you won't have anything to mentor. So this is another card I would probably skip. Moving on to whatever this thing is. It's trying. Let's leave it at that. Don't craft it. Don't craft it. Sorry. We have another questionable Planeswalker, just no. Let's move on to the Dryad, and this card is actually really good. If you craft this, you want 3 to 4 copies, probably 3, and quite obviously this goes in a token deck. Moving on to the second token card, we have March of the Multitude. This is another really good card, however, the drawback is, if you play this, you want 4 copies and you probably want 3 copies of the Dryad as well to go with it. Together they are amazing, but you're gonna have to spend a lot of wildcards to make the token deck. But there's not much bad to say about March of the Multitude. It's a really good card. Let's move on to Merfolk. If you play Merfolk, you quite obviously want this card, probably as 2 copies, maybe as many as 3, but I think 2 is more suitable, and there's not much to say about it. It's a really good card, and it's real annoying. Now, I have to say Merfolks are nowhere near tier 1, so if you do play Merfolks, it's more of a quick match deck. It's not a competitive deck at all to craft, so that's something you should keep in mind. The second Merfolk Lord thingy, nowhere near as good, just too expensive. And then we have the Mutable. If you hate other people and if you want to get roped forever, craft this card as a one-off and play it in a Teferi deck where you have no win condition except this guy and Teferi. You will win a lot of games, you will get roped quite a lot, and people will overall don't like you very much. Again, let's move on. I hate this card. Now we have a Pirate. If you're a die-hard Pirate fanboy, sure, otherwise, no. Let's move on to a really good card in the form of Nicholas Bolas. Now this guy is really good in control decks, quite obviously. You can play him in a 4-color control deck or just a triple color. There is not much else to say about this card. It is really good, and obviously it is a win condition in itself in a control deck. Then we have the Poor Dyer. This guy, no, expensive, does too little, missing haste. I mean, you could have this, or you could have an Angel. There's no contest there, really. Then we have Poor Darigas, the card that got me into Magic the second time I quit. But this version, no, just no. Too slow, and why would you play this when you can just play Arclight Phoenix? Then we have this thing, just another no card. Again, why play dragons when you can play birds? Then we have the Sun Avatar. This is another one that just... if you are a Dino Boy, yes. Otherwise, no. And there are not that many Dino Boys. And you can craft Dino decks that are a lot cheaper than having to include Mythic cards. Moving on, we have a second Dino card. Again, too expensive, does too little. Obviously, if the opponent actually can't deal with this card, you win the game with it. But it is a very shaky thing to bet your entire game upon. Moving on to a dragon, this one it's not very good, it's fun, but it doesn't have a place anywhere really. It's another quite easily skipped card. Let's move on to this elemental, and this card is not bad. It's not a tier 1 card, but it can be fun to use in ramp decks or in certain gate decks. Well, that's about it. It's just another fun card and something you can probably overlook quite easily. Let's move on to Mox Amber, and all I'm gonna have to say is no. Next up we have the Gateway. This card, no. It's not bad, but it's not good enough. Of course we have Crucible of Worlds. In Standard, no. And since MTG Arena is just Standard for the moment, it's a big no to crafting or even owning this card. Moving on, we have our last Planeswalker in the form of Karn. Obviously this card is really good and he fits into a lot of decks because he's colorless. I would craft this card no matter who you are really. You can always find a use for him, and I would stick with between 2 to 3 copies, although you can argue that you might want 4 cards, but only if you play artifacts. Speaking of artifacts, we have Weatherlight. This guy is obviously really good in artifact decks, but outside of artifact decks, he is not that relevant, and this is something you can probably quite easily skip unless you are a die-hard artifact player. And finally, we have the last card in the form of the Immortal Sun. This card is obviously really good, but this is a card you want to acquire when you have everything else that you want, and you usually only want 1 copies, maybe 2, but that is kinda stretching it. Anyway, that concludes this entire video. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I am gonna enjoy having to edit down this entire recording from, let's have a look at it. Oh, over an hour recording to be edited down to whatever length this video will be at. Right, this will be fun. Anyway, this is Project signing out. I catch you next time.